certain size, suddenly after that, two organizations of exactly the same size. So when an organization is given this much money, and this is the fact now, I'm not talking about hypotheses, this is a fact, the budget doubled, end of story. When this happens, an organization will have to use the money quickly, and typically if they don't use the money, you know that from the local council, for example. I mean, councils are famous for just digging up roads in, I think in spring in the UK, because the financial year ends in spring, and if they haven't spent the money, then they are not getting it the next day. So, you know, where I lived, I always watched how in spring these crazy, you know, work projects started, sometimes ripping up a road that they had just laid down the year before, and there were certain roads that were taken up, it seemed to me, every year. So to guarantee that the money is spent quickly on a small project at the end of the year, so that, you know, next year they get the big budget again. So the same thing also happens in all systems. So you can imagine that when this happens and this ginormous money flow starts coming into an organization like MI5, they very quickly have to hire lots of agents, they have to double the number of their informants, and everything has to double. Everything has to double. But when you turn it on, suddenly the first year when you hired nobody, they are swimming in money. They are absolutely swimming in money. You see, because the hiring process has to be gradual, but if you get the money straight away and you know this is like, it's like, you know, someone opening a second pipe, you know, it's just flooding in, the money is just flooding in. So what you expect from that, first of all, who do you think they can hire? Well, there's a lot of unemployed people, so they can only hire the unemployed, right? Or they can suck off people who are in other jobs, but that's unlikely, unless they give them really lucrative jobs. Pay for the heating of their house and this lot. Okay, so what you expect when the budget doubles is that suddenly there will be this, you know, fantastic amount of new hires who will be very quickly taught the tools of the trade. Now, what are the tools of the trade for MI5? It will be surveillance, right? So it will be stalking people, it will be bugging cars, bugging phones, bugging houses. It will be, you know, following people. It will be setting up certain scenes that they control. Okay, that sort of stuff. Those are the tools of the trade, you know. I mean, it's essentially surveillance, stalking, sabotage, you know, street theater, scenes, disconcerting scenes, trying to read out people's reactions, listening into their conversation, anything that can, first of all, get information from them and then influence them, you know, in their life, will be it. So who are you going to train these people on? All these new, you know, unemployed pensioners and young people. Ooh. Well, you need a lot of subjects for that, test subjects. So just by this fact that the budget of MI5 doubled, you expect a lot of unsuspecting people to come forward and say, I seem to be stalked by people. I seem to have my house under surveillance. You know, all these things seem to be happening. So this is not a surprise, people. That's what you freaking expect. Okay? Because if you double MI5's budget, they have to double their personnel. They have to. I mean, they can't just spend all this money on kit, because you need people to operate the kit, you know. So you either buy something really, really expensive, like you suddenly just buy satellites and you just scatter the sky with satellites. And I'm sure that happened too, but not just, okay? So if they have got satellites, you know, signal intelligence, they've got human intelligence, and, you know, lots of other, you know, flavors, and each of those will have probably their budget doubled. So even if you're just talking human intelligence, you will have to double it. And it's already a big operation. And when you double it, you have to train people. You have to train new entries. So you automatically expect people to come forward and say, I am being stalked by, and then the telltale is, does it fall into the category that you would expect? If people come forward and say, I'm being stalked by fairies or space aliens, then it's probably paranoia, like classical, you know, proper messed in the head. However, when they come forward and say, I'm being stalked by a lot of young people, like teenagers, early 20s, and I'm being stalked by a bunch of old men or old women, then that's what you would expect. Then you would think, hang on a second, you're in the UK, okay, I think it's much more likely that you fall into this category, that actually your life is now being used and you have been identified as, you know, sufficiently harmless, sufficiently less well connected, that you could, you know, someone would step up and actually complain for you. And you're most likely a prop, you know, in this ginormous training machinery that's now fired up to train up all these spies. Okay, so organized stalking, if a lot of people start coming forward and they say, you know, I am being stalked by these gangs, most likely your life is being used as training. So you stop asking, yeah, but what have you done? Do you have links to terrorism or whatever? Because would you actually train up your rookies on a real life terrorist or real life organized criminal? Probably not, because they probably end up with, you know, their head cut off in bed. So this is probably not good for training. So you wouldn't put your rookies onto real criminals, even if, you know, the target of this law and security or apparatus were to, you know, fight organized criminals. Let's assume that's the case. But even then, you wouldn't put your new entries onto the really tough cases because they wouldn't last a day in the job. So you would try to identify the most harmless individuals. So when people come forward and say, I'm being, you know, gang stalked and people gang up on me and I'm seeing all these weird scenes, ask, who do you think is doing this? You know, and if it falls into this rough pattern, or they say, you know what, all these people, they look really like, you know, I mean, I don't have any class issues or anything. I'm not saying it to, you know, put people down who are poor or anything. But if people say, yeah, you know, it's a lot, and they, I mean, I don't have any class issues or anything. I'm not saying it to, you know, put people down who are poor or anything. But if people say, yeah, you know, it's a lot of just, they seem to be very poor, you know, or very just, or I actually, sometimes you talk to these stalkers and they seem very uneducated. Nothing against uneducated people, nothing against poor people, but these people will be the target, you know, for simple tasks like street stalkers, for the street surveillance system. That's what you would expect, because you'd never have a professor of biochemistry going, oh yeah, you know what, I really want to give up my job and just stalk people in the street. No. So you're looking for people who are, you know, they need the money and they don't really have the level of education to do something else. So this is how to understand the organized stalking phenomenon. You know, if you think, hang on, could it be that, because in the UK we know it for sure, right? Now for Germany I also showed you that there were tax benefits. So if you only pay 10% of tax when you become part of the system as an informant, or, you know, whatever your title might be, of course, this system is going to recruit more and more people. So it will be a runaway process in Germany too. And, you know, after several decades of these tax laws being in place, you just expect the country to be swamped by these people, you know. And I think that's what we see now. And there's also a network effect. So in the beginning, only a few people know about this tax benefit and the system slowly grows. But as it grows, it doesn't grow linearly. In the end, there's a turn-on curve, because the probability that you come across, you're networked with someone in your life who knows about this and at some point will say, hey, did you know if you become an informant, you don't have to do much. Like literally, you just do nothing for most of the year, but you only pay 10% tax, you know. So there will also be a natural system effect, which is a non-linear turn-on curve, and that's a network effect. So networks spread information non-linearly. Because, you know, when you hit certain hubs, well-connected, very chatty people, they just blast information everywhere, and there are these non-linear effects. And the more people know, the more likely you are to have heard about it. So in Germany, by this tax law alone, and sorry, I'll show you the reference again. It's right here in this book. This is the very famous tax book in Germany. If you go to, this is now the 2011 edition, but it's called the Spitzelsteuer. Spitzelsteuer, only 10%. This is on page 60 on the 2011-2012 edition. So if you become an informant in Germany, you only pay 10% tax. In a country with tax rates of 20 to 40%, and ka-ching, you know, but it will lead to a runaway process. That's Germany. So in Germany, I'm not surprised that the country at some point gets swamped by snitches, by gang stalkers, by informants. That's like encoded. And people who put this in probably didn't know much about mathematics and didn't expect, because this is probably old. This is probably from like at least the 1960s or 70s, you know, if it's not actually straight from the 1950s. Please check the history of this tax law. But whenever they put it in, as a systems analyst, I can tell you that this will lead to nonlinear process because everybody will want to have it. So after a couple of decades, suddenly there will be just this explosion in snitches, you know, unless you actually, and the people in power want that. So it's very good because then you're controllable, then you work for them, you know. So in Germany, it's not surprising that there's a gang stalking explosion because of this tax law. In the UK, not surprising, there's this gang stalking explosion because MI5 budget doubled in 2003. No fat surprise. I would guess that the budget's also probably doubled in the US, and please check for other countries where I don't know much about it, but I would expect the war on terror, or the war of terror, as I call it, is global. It affects the Western world. So I think something similar must have happened in Japan, South Korea, you know, wherever. But please, you check, you do the research for your country. But this is how to understand and not be surprised when people talk about organized stalking. And do not put them down as paranoid, you know. Okay, this is so much about organized stalking.